If you follow the NFL, you probably saw Miami Dolphins quarterback Tua
Tagovailoa
suffer a devastating concussion on Thursday Night Football a few weeks ago. Now it's Damar Hamlin for the Bills, who ironically went into cardiac arrest last year after he was struck in the chest. He makes the tackle against Tua, but this time it's Tua who goes down. And you can see Tua go into this fencing posture, which is an involuntary response to severe head trauma. What happens is the brain tissue impacts the skull, causing the gray matter to shut down and the primitive brain stem to produce this fencing reflex. Now, by NFL football standards, that tackle wasn't especially violent. It's not head-to-head, and it's really Tua that initiates the contact by colliding into Damar Hamlin's chest. Damar Hamlin just sort of absorbs the blow. But what happens with concussions is that suffering from one puts you at greater risk to sustain future concussions. And this was Tua's third concussion since 2022. And now he's facing calls to retire from the game for good. And in my opinion, it would be prudent to do so if he cares about his health. But Tua's specific injury isn't the point of this video. I want to speak more generally about the long-term costs of repeated head trauma and how to assess the risks. Let's get into it. Now, football, of course, has generated a ton of public discussion around concussions, but my thoughts apply to all sports where collision or head contact is part and parcel of the game. I think it's important to make clear at the outset that the data around concussions is limited, and we should be careful about extrapolating for a few reasons. One is that many concussions go unreported because the athletes want to keep playing, and there isn't a culture around player safety in many of these sports. Also, the data varies by sport. So the combat sports, boxing, MMA, they don't yet have sufficient tracking metrics. And there are gradations of concussion, and that complicates the picture. So you have conspicuous violent ones, like in Tua's case, anyone can see he gets hit in the head, he's spasming, he can't get up. That's an obvious concussion. But the reality is that, to stick with football for a moment, there's head trauma on every single play. The ball is snapped, the linemen crash into one another, or a tight end makes a block. A receiver gets tackled. There may be no external blow to the head, but the athletes are constantly going from a stop to a full sprint to a full stop again upon impact. That causes an internal jolt within the skull, and the damage accrues over time. So it's death by 1,000 cuts. Now let's get into the data. As concussions have gained more public awareness, researchers are doing more studies. A systematic review from 2018 looks at the incidence of concussions based on a handful of electronic databases. This review measures athlete exposure, or AE, defined as one athlete participating in one game or practice, and shows the concussion incidence rate as X per 1,000 athlete exposures. Starting with adult athletes in game, we see that rugby, football, and ice hockey have the highest concussion incidence. They also split the data for in practice, and again, same top three, but women's ice hockey and American football switch places. And then for youth sports, the data isn't split by practice versus gameplay or by gender, but it's a similar picture with rugby, ice hockey, and American football in the top three. You'll notice that several fighting sports that would intuitively seem to be high risk for concussions, like boxing or MMA, are absent from this list. And that's because, as I've said before, there weren't reliable tracking metrics for those sports, so they were excluded. But if we just think about the mechanism of action, taking repeated blows to the head in boxing or MMA is going to result in a high incidence of head trauma. Wrestling is up there as well because of the takedowns, and in recent years, soccer has been recognized as causing head injuries because of the headers. So given all that, how should we think about the long-term effects of sports-related head trauma? And this is where CTE comes in. CTE stands for chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and it's a neurodegenerative disorder caused by repeated head injuries. It's difficult to study because at the moment it can only be definitively detected through an autopsy. So these studies rely on donated brains of deceased individuals to brain banks. Also, it's not known how common CTE is in the population, but it appears to be rare. And according to the Mayo Clinic, CTE shows up in two forms. There's an earlier stage, 20s, 30s, manifests itself as emotional and behavioral problems such as aggression, depression, lack of impulse control. And there's a second form that shows up later in life, around middle age, that creates issues in thinking and memory, and is often a precursor for dementia. Now, importantly, And counterintuitively, the latest research shows that the odds of developing CTE are not strongly correlated with the number of concussions a person incurs. Rather, the two most important variables associated with the development of CTE are one, the number of head impacts, and two, the strength of those head impacts. Let's talk about the number of hits first. A good analogy here is the effect of alcohol or smoking. I don't have to get blackout drunk to experience poor health outcomes from drinking. Any amount less than 0 is harmful, and more is always worse. Same with smoking. There's no set specific amount of smoking that necessarily produces lung cancer. Some people might smoke a pack of cigarettes every day and never get lung cancer. Other people might smoke very little or not smoke at all and get lung cancer. Genetics and environmental factors play a big role. But the point is, your risk goes up with more exposure. And the same is true of head impacts and CTE. This is why on the football field, it's the linemen who are most prone to developing CTE. For them, there's impact on every single play. And if we look at a plot that shows the number of head impacts against the odds of developing CTE, we can see that the graph is exponential. So each successive head impact increases the odds of developing CTE more than the last one. Now let's get into that second factor, the strength of hits. The Boston University CTE Center defines the strength of hits as the maximum linear or rotational acceleration experienced by the head. But not all brain injuries trigger symptoms. This is the idea of a subconcussion, which goes back to what I said about the linemen. There's brain damage accumulating from the continual impact on each play, but it's not necessarily perceptible in the moment. And the force at which head impacts increase CTE risk is currently unknown. So at one end of the spectrum, if I flick my head with my finger, that probably doesn't do anything. But if I were to use my fist, that would do a little bit more. And a bowling ball, yeah, that would be very problematic. But we don't know where exactly on that continuum the damage starts. Now, if you take those two factors, the number of head impacts and the strength of those impacts, and look at the cumulative total over a lifetime, that metric is what's most correlated to CTE risk. Now let's consider a few examples of athletes who've suffered from CTE. Famously, Aaron Hernandez, who played tight end for the New England Patriots and was convicted for murder in 2015, and 2 years later tragically committed suicide. It was said by a researcher who studied his brain posthumously that he had one of the worst cases of CTE that she had ever seen for a person of his age. Hernandez isn't the only one. He belongs to a growing list of ex-professional athletes that includes NFL safety Dave Gerson, NFL linebacker Junior Seau, professional wrestler Chris Benoit, who struggled with mental health and behavioral problems, and all ultimately committed suicide. Their brains were studied posthumously, and they were all found to have severe CTE. Now, I'm not saying CTE is the sole reason that they committed their crimes or committed suicide, but there is a pattern. And in recent years, researchers have found that symptoms are appearing in young people. So this isn't only an issue that affects college or pro athletes. The Boston University CTE Center released a study last year that looked at the brains of 152 athletes who died under the age of 30 and found that 41% showed signs of CTE. And that's in comparison to community brain banks that show a baseline of under 1% CTE incidence for the general population. Do keep in mind, though, that these samples were drawn from people whose brains had been donated for posthumous study and were showing symptoms before death. So there's selection bias here, and the true prevalence of CTE is unknown. But this research shows that CTE can affect young amateur athletes. Now, for those of you who participate in collision sports or have a child who does, the Boston University CTE Center released a prevention protocol with evidence-backed recommendations that reduce the risk of CTE. Basically, the goal should be to reduce those two factors most associated with CTE risk: total hits to the head and the strength of those hits. So that can mean delaying the start of an athlete's career, reducing the number of drills that involve the most head impacts, adjusting techniques or rules in the game to minimize head impacts, that sort of thing. But my personal view is that the benefits don't outweigh the costs for these contact sports, especially rugby, football, and the fighting sports like MMA and boxing. But I know football is a favored American pastime that brings people together, and I certainly empathize with the need for physicality and community building, but I think there are more creative ways of achieving those ends that don't involve repeated head trauma. So I'm happy to see the trend of reduced participation in American football, but ultimately everyone has to make their own assessment. And I'd love to hear from anyone who played contact sports, especially at a high level, what their experience was. Did they ever get concussed? Do they have any regrets? Would they let their kids play? So let me know down in the comments. That's it. I'll see you all next time.